would you feel if you couldn't talk? Say you could only listen. You had no voice to share your opinions, decisions, or dreams. You wouldn't know what having this voice felt like, but you would long to. Well, all these things may be an example of how women of the 1900s may have felt. These women were basically not citizens of the United States of America. They had no right to vote, no voice in their government, and they were not tried by their peers. It was unconstitutional. These women started a war and put their hearts into everything for women. But the war never stopped. Women everywhere continued what their ancestors had started. One woman, an architect of the most outrageous political achievements, fought for women until her death. This woman was Alice Paul. Today I will be telling you a little bit about Alice Paul and her background. I will be illustrating her struggle to get women the vote and how it has affected women today. I never doubted that equal rights was the right direction. Most reforms, most problems are complicated, but to me there's nothing complicated about ordinary equality. Confidence and logic spills out of that statement by Alice Paul, relating to her efforts to fight for the 19th Amendment. Alice Paul's interest in women's rights started in England, a place she went to study. She participated in radical protests for women's rights, including hunger strikes, and was jailed for a period of time. England was where she became a true suffragist. That fall, Alice went to NASA, the National Women's Suffragist Association, hoping to join forces to push for a constitutional amendment. NASA allowed her to take over NASA's Congressional Committee in Washington, D.C. Nothing discouraged Alice, even having no office, no budget, and few supporters. At this time, she was only 26 years old. Trying to change her luck and encourage support for her cause, she went to President Woodrow Wilson for help. She organized the biggest parade ever seen. On March 13, 1913, which was the eve of President Woodrow Wilson's inauguration, 8,000 suffragists marched down Pennsylvania Avenue. The 500,000 people in attendance were not at all impressed. The parade was a huge stepping stone in the fight for women's rights. It increased publicity, and never missing a beat, Alice realized this was a good time to lobby President Woodrow Wilson. Alice and many other suffragists met President Woodrow Wilson, who didn't appear interested and said the time was not right. Alice knew to keep the pressure on. She started the CUWS, the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage, supported by NASA, and dedicated this to achieving the federal amendment. This held matters, and the Senate prepared to debate the issue for the first time. It looked as if things may finally lighten up, and the chance that Alice and many supporters had longed for had come. Little did they know a new setback would be right around the corner. The women of this organization continued to stage demonstrations, parades, mass meetings, picketings, fires, hunger strikes, and lobbying. The tactic was to hold the Democratic Party responsible for not taking actions to franchise women in the United States government. On January 10th, the NWP began their most controversial protest ever, picketing at the White House. This bold action at first was ignored, but as World War I broke out, people began to become angered by the protests. Spectators began assaulting these women. The police did nothing to protect them. Instead, they arrested them on the charge of obstructing traffic. Little did President Woodrow Wilson know that he too was committing a crime, the crime of obstructing democracy. Women continued to picket and protest, even as fellow picketers were sent to jail. In a final effort to break the spirit of these women, police arrested Alice Paul and sentenced her to 7 months in prison. In these 7 months, Alice continued her battle and started a hunger strike to continue on. Alice's decision did not sit well with prison officials. She was placed in the psychopathic ward and deprived of sleep. A bright light was directed on her every night at random, and they threatened her constantly. During the last week of her 22-day hunger strike, they brutally forced a tube up her nose and down her throat, which poured liquid into her stomach. This process went on 3 times a day for 3 weeks. She was determined to die for her cause, but she wouldn't give up. The women had days of brutal beatings, which included one woman suffering from a heart attack after her cellmate was knocked out cold by a prison guard. Newspapers picked up the stories and ran with them. The force feeding angered Americans and increased publicity. On January 19, 1918, President Woodrow Wilson announced his support for the women's suffrage amendment. On August 26, 1920, almost 2 years later, the last state to ratify the amendment did, and women voted in the 1920 presidential election. The fight took 72 years, 2 centuries, and 18 presidencies and 3 wars. Today, women everywhere are benefiting from what Alice Paul did. Women now make up 46.5% of the labor force, and that percentage is constantly growing. The gender wage gap has also decreased by 6%, and women are getting into more colleges everywhere. Today I have talked about Alice Paul, her struggles, and how she has affected women today. Today there are still many battles to win. We have to find the stride that our ancestors had and fight for what is right and what we believe. In the wise words of President Woodrow Wilson, we have forgotten the history of our country if we have forgotten when to agitate.